I think you need to think about the bigger picture too, that QI serve to improve quality and improve patient care. I think that is, if anything, your main goal, or really altruistic objective, that is really what really is fulfilling. But a lot of you, I think, either don't know how to get it started, you don't know what QI actually is. So that's where Adam's input here is going to be really, really useful to give you an insight of how you can engage in QI here and how best. A few housekeeping notes, particularly for junior doctors here, the conquest. Not meaning to alarm more of you guys, but obviously, as you may have seen in the news, our rates for COVID are slowly going up, perhaps slightly alarming, but there's no reason to panic. But it just goes to show the main reminding messages for you guys is wear your masks, protect yourself properly, wear PPE where it's appropriate, and particularly when eating, be very mindful of your distances and try not to congregate in massive groups, because we've got to protect each other and our patients as well. And I think Simon probably has something to say about that. Please, Simon, go ahead.
I was only going to say, I'm sorry I'm late, but just everyone needs to be aware that there's no such thing as a work bubble. So it doesn't exist either within healthcare or indeed within the government legislation. So we have household bubbles, but no work bubbles. So just because we work with each other doesn't mean that we can all sit in a very small space with our masks off. And although this is a disease predominantly of people with disabilities, young people do get sick with it. And even if we're not that bothered about getting sick from COVID acutely, I've seen a number of people with long COVID, and it is really quite disabling. So I think from a personal point of view, we should all agree that we'd rather not get COVID. And from our colleagues' point of view, some of whom will have health problems that A, they may not know about, but B, you won't know about even if they do. And obviously our colleagues include not just the other doctors. So we need to be really careful, and we need to be pulling each other up firmly but nicely. If people are not wearing their masks, they need to. And the last thing I would say is a lot of our rooms, doctors' rooms that people use are quite small. And even with masks on, we need to limit the number of people in those rooms at any one time. We need to open the windows to improve ventilation. And we just need to be really, really careful. That was all I was going to say, Steve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. I think that's about it, apart from saying if junior doctors on the medical on call, if you've got your red zone patients, particularly make sure that you are seeing them promptly and asking for a post-take ward round review urgently after you've seen these patients. Please don't leave those cases for the end of the day or something to be post-taked. They need to be seen quickly so that we can get them to the right ward. I think that's all we'll say about COVID in this setting. I really want to bring the screen back to Adam so he can talk to us about QI. Adam, the show's all yours. If you want to share your screen or your presentation, please go ahead.
Yep, I'll just get my slideshow going. Actually, I'm going to share my screen first. One moment.
Yeah, we can definitely see.
So, can you see that the first slide of the slideshow there?
Yep, definitely.
Great. So what I'm going to talk about today is basically what we've always given as our general introduction to QI. So it's really a level of improving your awareness of what quality improvement's all about, a few of the key concepts, and a bit of detail about how QI projects might be delivered. Stephen had put across to me that people had an appetite for more practical examples, a bit more context, and so what I've done with this presentation is cut out a lot of the kind of more vague corporate stuff that we previously had in there, which I'm sure you'll all be happy to hear, and replaced it with examples mostly from projects I worked on myself, which I can speak about to illustrate each of the core parts of quality improvement. I would emphasize that this isn't anything close to an exhaustive explanation of QI or QI techniques. We do everything up to a full 5 days of training, the QSA practitioner course. So if you come away from this still feeling like you're not completely clear, it is only an hour, and it's quite difficult to summarize quality improvement in an hour, but I'll do my best to kind of give a good overview. And the projects that I'm going to talk about are not necessarily perfect gold standard projects. I don't think there are any perfect QI projects, but hopefully they kind of get some of the key points across. So here's a couple of definitions of quality improvement. There isn't one perfect gold standard definition of QI, but these ones are the ones that we tend to use. It's a continuous, unceasing effort to make changes that will lead to better outcomes and performance and better professional development, and it involves understanding where we are and systematically applying ideas to make our care better and safer. So the sort of key take-home things about what quality improvement is about are that it's a continuous process. So we're not identifying something that we want to change, dipping into it as a one-off, and then maybe moving on to something else and coming back to it, or we're not investing a lot of resource in one thing and then forgetting about it. We're building upon what we've learned each time that we work on something and continuing to improve those things. And even maybe if we've got an area of work where we're doing quite well, we're still looking for ways that we can be more efficient or achieve better outcomes. And another key element of quality improvement is that there should be a patient benefit outcome at the end of everything that we do. So it's not just an approach to management. You wouldn't use quality improvement methods just to achieve a performance indicator that had no direct link to patient outcomes. It must be to improve outcomes in terms of care that we deliver. And it's also about being systematic. So that's about saying that we're going to use a set of approaches and tools that we know are evidence-based and that we can see have been effective in other organizations and historically, as opposed to what sometimes can happen in big organizations like ESHT, where around the organization people are using quite different approaches to delivering change, some of which may be more effective than others. So it's applying a framework and a structure to every time we make a change within the organization. So I think when we talk about quality improvement, people often probably think about the classic patient safety issues, things like bed sores, falls, lapses in care, things where patients have come to harm, and that is a part of the work that we continue to do within the QI team. However, it's not all that quality improvement works upon. So anything that we can do to make the way that the organization runs more effective or more efficient, or make people able to do their job better, can be defined as a part of quality improvement. So some of the things that we do in QI might be quite straightforward, obvious things that are just around reorganizing the workspace, having things labeled and prepared in a way that makes them easier to access for a person who's doing a particular task. So they're not necessarily always very clinical in nature. They're not always necessarily very technical or involving a lot of complex data. It can be something as simple as looking for interventions that might improve people's engagement and quality of life at work. So we know that those kind of things actually have a measurable impact on patient care. And other things that we might look at, for example, standardization, that comes up a lot at ESHT because we have different sites delivering similar services in different ways, and one or the other of those might be more or less effective. And there are a lot of methods that we use to look at things like demand and capacity, and making services that we deliver more efficient, eliminating waste, looking for things that maybe we've been doing for some time that are no longer the best or the most valid way of delivering a service. So eliminating things that aren't useful or helpful. I'm sorry if the slides keeps flipping back and forth. I think I've copied in some slides that had timings on them, so they're moving without my input, which is a bit annoying, but there's nothing I can do at this point. In the QI team, we're really keen for people to be enthusiastic and keen to join in with delivering changes that they think might be improvements. However, we generally encourage everyone to get in touch with us and try to find out a bit more about the best practice ways of doing that before launching straight into it. That doesn't mean that we're going to subject you to a load of bureaucracy and paperwork. We don't do that at all. We're sort of more in an advice giving role, but if people just launch into an improvement project without kind of having a basic understanding of how QI functions, you might do things that are not as helpful. So the basic overall structure of quality improvement that we use at ESHT is what's called the model for improvement. So the model for improvement is not the only QI methodology, and there are some other sort of schools of QI, but it's one that's been used across quite a number of NHS trusts and has been shown to have achieved good results in the organisations that have used it in the NHS. And the model for improvement needs for us to answer 3 key questions. The first of which is, what is it that we're trying to improve, or what is it that we're trying to accomplish? So quite often when a service or a lead or a group of staff come to us with a motivation to make improvements, what we'll find is that what they think needs to be improved isn't necessarily the real goal once you go a bit deeper into what's really going on in that area. So it could be, for example, that in the first instance, a team or group of staff tell us that they're not meeting their targets, or they've got a big task that they were supposed to achieve and that hasn't happened yet. But those are just management goals, and that's not what QI is designed for. And so we turn that into a goal that actually has a patient benefit. How is this big project that you need to deliver, or this performance indicator that you need to meet, actually linked to a meaningful outcome? And do we know that there's a link between those things, or can we go a bit further down the kind of logical steps of what's causing the problem that is leading to the outcomes not to be as positive as we want at the moment? So we start by making sure that we've defined our aim as clearly as possible. The second step is to ensure that whatever we do is something that's measurable. So how will we know that a change is an improvement? So one of the necessary parts of a quality improvement project is that it's something that can be measured. We're not just saying that because we've delivered a change or we've run a project that we can tick that off and say that we've made an improvement, because a change isn't necessarily improvement. Sometimes people think that, say, implementing a new piece of equipment or an IT system or something of that nature counts as an improvement. But unless you can measure an outcome that shows that some evidence that it's an improvement, then we don't know that. And something that's probably important to put across is that in QI, we always take data in time series. So you would look for something which you can measure on a regular basis, which can sometimes be a bit tricky at ESH depending on what data you have access to, but that's a sort of another conversation. And then once we've identified what it is that we want to change and how we can measure that and know that we've made an improvement to it, then the next step would be to think of a number of different ways that you might approach that problem. So an important principle in quality improvement is that you're not jumping to conclusions or starting with an intervention or a change already in mind. You're keeping an open mind, and you can go through a range of different activities to kind of generate those ideas, whether with that sort of through brainstorming with the team of people, or through looking at best practice, or delving into the data. You've got to go through a process of scoping out different potential solutions, because that's what leads into the following step, which is then we start testing those different ideas in isolation. So we're not just launching into everything that we think that might help at the same time, but we're testing out different potential improvements one at a time, and then looking at the data to see which might have made an impact. So this approach
Adam,
is.
do you mind if I just ask something very quickly? Sorry,
Yeah, go
sorry
ahead.
to interrupt.
Yeah, and sorry, I was going to say, if
really
anybody has questions, please do interrupt, because yeah, go on.
It's just going back to your original slide about contacting you guys. What is the best way to contact the QI department? Is it by email, by telephone? Is it a specific hub you guys run, or?
Yeah, I was going to mention it at the end, although it's a little
Oh,
bit.
My bad. Listen.
No,
let
well,
me shut up for now, and you carry on. Actually,
I might as well explain. I may not be able to fully answer that question because we've just had a big upheaval where we've been moved out of our office, and the QI hub, which there is a QI hub, but it's not at the moment because it's all been turned over to the vaccination effort. So that area has been stripped out, and we have moved over to a sort of new location. And I'm not sure what the extension would be for the phone line, but our standard email, esht.improvement, is probably the best way to contact us at the moment. Although we're very short-staffed, quite a few people have left our team recently, so we're not necessarily going to respond instantly. But no, please do get in touch if there's a question.
Thanks, Adam. That's useful. Sounds like you know a QI for the QI department.
Yes, it's always the way.
No worries. Carry on. Sorry.
No worries. Yeah, so the quality improvement approach differs from what maybe the traditional approach to delivering changes might be within the NHS of piloting a change, and piloting changes in a management sense often means we've gathered together a few good ideas, and although it's called a pilot study, it's often quite resource intensive in the sense that it might be delivered across a fairly substantial part of the organization for a significant amount of time. And probably the other big difference is that often what we do is a lot of analysis and planning and meetings and committees before doing anything. And quality improvement tries to turn that on its head a bit, where we go into testing things on a small scale at a fairly early stage, so that rather than trying to predict and anticipate all of the things that we think might work, we're just gathering data much more quickly. But when I say on a small scale, it might be on a very small scale. So perhaps, just one clinician is adopting this change to see what they make of it, or, on some of the things that we're doing at the moment, we're doing on one bay of one ward and seeing what their feedback is. And by doing that, you're ironing out all of the small problems that might be identified and ruling out things that really don't work before trying to roll them out on a larger scale, where the impact, if they don't work properly, would be much more disruptive. So it's a more efficient way of making changes because we're finding out what works as we go along. So I spoke a bit about this already, but in terms of trying to define clearly what it is that you're trying to accomplish, that's also about having a goal which is clear and measurable. I know most people will have probably come across SMART goals a lot because they come up in lots of training courses. It is important that people don't approach improvement thinking that they're either going to achieve perfect outcomes, or, as I mentioned, just thinking that delivering a project or a change is an improvement outcome. What we want is something that we can measure empirically and say, what we think would be realistic, or what would be a good improvement, would be X percentage increase or decrease in a particular thing. And you could get that number from looking at benchmarks from other trusts, or from what a good month looks like compared to a bad month. It can be a bit arbitrary, but it's about thinking about what a realistic target is for improvement and defining that. So what I was going to talk through here is the first sort of example I had. And this is a project that I thought was a really good example of scoping out the problem. So this was a person, I think it was Marie Dixon from the hematology department, and she came on our quality improvement, the Pdsa training, and she wanted to reduce the numbers of errors in blood samples and get to the bottom of why these errors were happening, that the samples are coming to pathology that couldn't be tested for one reason or another. And if you look at the bottom left table, these are the different types of sample errors that come up in pathology, and I can't remember what any of those acronyms stand for, but some of you might be familiar with them. But if I recall correctly, I think some of the main problems were that the patients' samples were being labelled incorrectly, and there was another type of error where they were being left out for too long before they reached the pathology department. So so what Marie had done here was to put all of the different types of errors into a bar chart and what we call a Pareto analysis. And I won't give the details of that, sometimes called the 80-20 rule, which is basically principle that usually when you've got some kind of thing that you can break down into different factors, around 80% of the cases will fit into one or two of those categories. And in this instance, there were a couple of types of errors that Marie identified, which were far more frequent than the others. So because all of those types of errors had different causes and characteristics, we don't want to focus on all of the ones which happen very infrequently, and we could focus our improvement effort here on the ones that were much more common. So that was one starting point, that we'd identified which types of errors are happening often and therefore are the best opportunity for improvement. Then what you can see on the right here was some direct observation that Marie did. So this is what we call a spaghetti diagram. So she went and sat in the emergency department and had just watched people going about their work when they were in the process of taking these samples, and tried to identify where are the problems happening, where are things getting left behind, where have people got to walk unnecessary distances in order to use a piece of equipment, or perhaps there's paperwork piling up. And that was one of the steps in having a better understanding of what might be going wrong. And actually I missed a step here, but the reason that she went to the emergency department to do that is that the other analysis that she did was which area were the most of these errors or incorrect samples coming from, and it was the emergency department. So again, by gathering that data, we were able to identify the best place to focus our improvement efforts in order to get a better outcome. And so after that, had a really good idea of where the problem was, some information about why it was happening, and then after that we could start to plan our change ideas with a much better understanding of the issue. So the techniques that we used in that project are only just a few of the techniques you could use. Sometimes improvement projects would use a root cause analysis. So as I mentioned previously, you look at what is the cause of the problem, but what are the underlying causes below that? So, you might have a patient safety issue in a particular area, but then you're told that that's happening because of poor staffing. And then why is the staffing low? Well, that's because there's a lot of turnover and a lot of sickness. Well, why is that? And as you go through those sort of multiple questions, the 5 whys, as we would call it, you might find that the real underlying cause is something completely different from what you were talking about to begin with. Also, what you might be most familiar with, sort of looking at auditing some notes, finding out what's happened, having a kind of deep dive into patients who've had a particular problem that you're interested in, getting all of the staff together who are involved in the area of work that you're trying to improve, and asking them the questions about what do they think is causing the issue, what problems have they identified. So something to really emphasize about quality improvement is that it's essential that it starts with some kind of engagement of the people who are doing the work, and we're trying our best to gather information from people who are at the sort of frontline ground level, who've got the most relevant, up-to-date understanding of what might be causing problems. And another method that we can use is called process mapping, which is where we kind of map out the whole process, whether that's a care pathway or a particular procedure, writing it up into a diagram where we can see visually perhaps where there are bottlenecks in a process, or where we know that problems are happening. And I'll show an example of a process map in a minute. But as I say, another reason not to kind of dive straight into a piece of work without taking a structured approach is that the start of that approach would always be the engagement process. And hopefully we can also access patient views. At the very least, we should be talking to staff who've got an experience of the problem that we're looking at before kind of jumping to a solution. So
Adam, would you mind if I just butt in there for a second?
Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say that was fantastic. It was really nice to see that spaghetti process. That's
yeah, it was
really
a good little project.
how that nice project just gives you a really good benefit, isn't it? I just really wanted to say to juniors as well, what Adam was saying about stakeholder engagement is absolutely crucial, because if you don't think about everyone involved in that process, I'm sure Adam will agree with this, you missing someone out whose input is extremely valuable to actually designing a good QI. I remember when I first did my first QI with a IT program for clinics, and I totally forgot to engage with one of the most important stakeholders, which is the outpatient clerical staff, because they're the ones who book the appointments, and I totally forgot about them because I didn't think about mapping them out. And because of that, if I had done that, I would have probably changed my whole process. So I think that it's a valuable mistake, is that you must try to plan out who's involved completely. If you do the homework, you're more likely to get a more efficient result. Would you agree with that, Adam, normally? Or
100%. Yeah, the example that you've got is funny to me, because in my first sort of project management job in healthcare, I made the exact same mistake, and I didn't consult with the sort of administrative staff who would be affected by the change that I wanted to make. It was the sort of HEAs who made appointment bookings, and of course there was a lot of resistance once I actually tried to bring that change about.
Absolutely.
But that's very common, isn't it? That if you haven't thought about the IT guy or the administrator or whoever's going to be impacted, then you'll get pushback when you try to make a change.
Absolutely.
And it's not just people like in those supportive roles, but also if you try to implement a change without consulting people who've got a specialist interest in it, again, they're going to say, well, why didn't you talk to me? Because I've got expertise that you could have drawn upon. Or, something that you'll often get is, well, we tried something like this previously and you didn't know that because you're new, and it didn't work, or, for whatever reason, we're not doing it now. So if you haven't had those conversations, and often it's just having the conversation itself, it's sort of showing people that you care about their input. And yeah, but I mean, you could talk all day about stakeholder engagement. It is a unit on the kind of full training. So I would encourage people to kind of learn more about that before kind of initiating anything.
Absolutely. I think you got to get your knowledge right, and you've got these training videos on your website, is that right?
Yeah, there is one, and I was going to sort of plug them at the end of the thing. But yeah, there's one online about stakeholder engagement.
Cramping your style here, Adam. I'm going to shut.
No, that's all right. Please do chip in, because actually that was probably something I should have emphasized more. I think that was on one of the slides that I took out. So yeah, getting the right people involved before you make changes is 100% a key element. So what I talked about as a second step in the model for improvement is ensuring that we've got some measurement in place to know that any change that we've made has had a positive impact. So we're not just assuming that something that we know is best practice or what have you is beneficial just because there might be evidence out there. We need to be able to measure it here. So I've copied in some data from patient falls that it's something that I've been working on for a couple of years now. And what you can see in the chart at the top is what's called an SPC chart, so statistical process control. And the idea of that is to plot your data in time series, so over time. You need quite a lot of data points in order for it to be useful in this format. And the SPC chart has two lines which are the control limits, which for those that are familiar with these kind of stats, they're 3 standard deviations above and below the mean. But again, that's something we explain in detail on the full training. But what it's useful for is that you can look at the data and see if there's a single point that's an outlier that's way above what you would anticipate, or if there's a series of points that are going all over the place, up and down. And things like that help us to identify where there might be issues happening, or do we have, seasonal variation, or has our quality of care in a particular area suddenly increased or decreased recently? And it sounds, I thought when I first learned about it sounded like a fairly obvious thing to do, but what you see across the NHS is managers looking at really just the data from this month and the month previously, and so we've got no idea about the trends over time, and a lot of the time those month-to-month changes are really just normal variation. It's just fluctuation based on a number of random factors, and we want to look at the longer term trends so that we can establish the difference between things that are happening because of something significant, like a problem or an improvement, and things that are just part of the normal variation. So yeah, this was the data for AMU at EDGH, which is one of the areas that we kind of focused on for falls. Obviously, they have a very high turnover of patients, a lot of whom are acutely ill, so it's not a surprise that they do experience a lot of patient falls. But we wanted to find out more about that and identify what might be causing those problems so that we could try and make some improvements. We also analysed the datixes and what the causes of different falls were. And again, this is a bit of a Pareto analysis that we saw that really there were certain types of falls that were much more frequent, where patients are falling whilst unattended or mobilising independently. So that information was able to kind of guide the start of our improvement work, because we could see that really the falls weren't happening because people were tripping over or slipping on a puddle or something like that. They were happening actually because of perhaps patients' understanding of the advice that's given to them, that they're getting out of bed and trying to move about on their own, even though we've asked them not to. So now we're looking at how do we improve communication and awareness and information that we give to patients, so that data has kind of guided our improvement work. And I also analysed some of the texts from those datixes to look for sort of clues as to what was going on. A point of interest for this project, which comes up quite a lot in QI, is that the outcome that we're concerned with here is reducing falls. However, the frequency of falls, particularly on a small area like AMU, isn't that high that it's easy to detect an improvement after, say, for example, we go onto that ward and we put a bunch of posters up which have got some information that we hope is going to reduce falls. Chances are there would only have been 1 or 2 falls in the following week anyway, and over a longer period of time we might be able to detect an improvement. But in QI we want to get some feedback fairly quickly, so what we often would do is to measure the process itself and whether we're delivering that effectively. So for example, with falls, we would be measuring things like how frequently are staff having a conversation with a patient about their falls risk, or can we put some measurement in place of how well they've understood that advice, or how effectively have the falls risk assessments been filled out. But quite often you have to come up with what we call a process measure, a measurement of the sort of quality of the care that we're delivering, or the process that we're putting in place to indirectly affect the outcome measure, because sometimes the outcome measure can take a long time to respond to our changes. So then to talk about the next step, or the last sort of scoping step in quality improvement, which is generating those ideas and thinking about what are all the things that we could do that might result in an improvement. Sometimes you'll come up with things that you know can be delivered quite easily, that are clearly a positive thing, and it's not always necessary to measure absolutely everything. You don't want to sort of crowbar the whole QI approach into every change that you make. Like, for example, with the Falls project, we identified some things that were trip hazards at an early point and just moved them. We're not going to say we're going to test whether or not people trip. When there's a trip hazard, you just fix that problem. And sometimes there are things like that that are quick wins. But broadly speaking, we're looking at creating a kind of a list and then generating lots of ideas that we can start testing. So this here is a process map, and process mapping is one of the activities that you can do to generate ideas. And this was a process map we did for falls reduction in the emergency department about a year and a half ago. And so if you look at this, this starts with you know, a patient coming in through the front door, and we're looking at all of the sort of processes that take place. The ambulance driver handing over risk information, moving that patient from a waiting area to a cubicle, and then the kind of clinical elements that then happen of them being assessed by a doctor or a nurse practitioner. And as we go through that mapping with the staff who work in that area, they'll be raising things like, oh, maybe we don't get the most accurate information when that patient is handed over at that point, or the patient tends to get stuck at this point because there are never enough beds, or whatever it is. And then this moves through to the sort of the end of that process. They either go to a ward or they don't, or they're discharged. And again, they've so the sort of pink stickers here, some of the things that they identified as problems, saying that when there were, you know, unfamiliar staff there, or things that weren't being implemented, like risk labels that could have been used. And also you can identify opportunities. So, you know, by going through this process of talking through each stage of the pathway, people might come up with things like, oh, we said we were going to do that, or this could be fixed quite easily. So this is one way that we usually find is quite effective of generating those ideas and identifying the problems. This is another one that I was involved in for the tissue viability nursing team. And I put it in a slightly different format here because there were lots of problems, so we created more space for that. But the basic principle is the same, that you've got all the sources of referrals in, how those referrals are sort of being triaged, who's talking to the patient, and then they're reviewed, and are they assessed effectively? And by having that conversation with the staff who were involved, it was possible to identify a whole load of problems about people who didn't have the right training, patients not complying with the treatment properly, problems around shift times and staffing levels. So there was a whole list of things. So in this format, it's kind of just a bucket list of problems, all kind of not in any particular order. What we would normally do in quality improvement is to organize those issues or ideas into what we call a driver diagram, which I think should be the next slide. So this was the driver diagram for the TVN project. So I've worked with the lead of that piece of work to take those different ideas and organize them into I suppose themes or categories of things, and which feed into the overall outcome or aim, which in this case was improving the treatment of leg ulcers. And so, you know, in this case, the key themes were around the sort of efficiency and how they were organizing their service, things like cancellations, appropriate referrals, and accurate assessment, which comes up in a lot of quality improvement projects. Is the paperwork being filled out effectively? Could we do more? And is the intervention itself effective and achieving what we hope it would for the patient? And so the idea of a driver diagram is you work down, I mean, sometimes there are more levels to it than this. This is a pretty simple one, but you would work down from all of the causal factors that affect the improvement outcome that we're trying to achieve, and eventually you would arrive at change ideas. So the ones along the right hand side here are things that we might be able to actually implement, and then after you've done that, you can have a conversation about, well, which of these do we think are going to be the most potentially impactful, and how realistic and possible to actually deliver are each of them. So putting them into a sort of a matrix of their potential impact versus their ease of delivery, and then kind of identifying what our best opportunities are. And that's, at that point, we've got a plan to actually start delivering our Pdsa cycles. So actually testing changes. So this is actually the real data from that piece of work. And so as you can see, the data on the number, so we focused on the process measure of assessments completed, because that was identified as a big part of the problem with the leg ulcer treatment. And at the end here in April 2020 was when the lead of that piece of work started in sort of making some changes to try and improve the completion of those assessments. And so that's where our first sort of Pdsa cycle is, that we've made a change and we can actually see that it made a big impact. I mean, what had actually happened in that case was that some of the tissue viability nurses had been redeployed to areas where they could kind of help more with completing the assessment. So it was a bit of a COVID factor in this case, but nonetheless, that's what it would. This is what it would look like when you're starting to implement some QI, or what it should look like. That you've got a long baseline of data, so you know what the normal data looks like and how it varies, and then you can see here that the improvement goes above the upper control limit. So we can see that it's a sort of statistically significant, or we suspect it's a statistically significant improvement. So another example that I was going to go into, as I mentioned, a lot of improvement work sometimes focuses on improving, working on demand and capacity. And this was a piece of work I did in an organisation that I worked at previously, where I was responsible for delivering screening. So it was actually in a prison, and we wanted to deliver health check screening, like cardiovascular health screening, in the same way that people would be offered in the community via their GP. But the initial design of this this sort of service, or this clinic, was quite inefficient, because we had 3 staff, 2 sort of non-clinical and 1 nurse, and when we were all doing the same kind of work, it wasn't very effective, because we would be then waiting on the capacity of the nurse to deliver the blood spot tests and the blood test. So it was a dry blood spot test for blood-borne diseases, and a blood test for blood glucose for diabetes. But in this design, it was quite inefficient, because we were doing one thing at a time, and each patient was moving through that process one at a time, rather quite slowly. So what we did in order to change that, the first thing was to ensure that the person who was causing the bottleneck, which is the nurse who was delivering who was the only one who could deliver the blood spot tests, focused on that activity. So that increased the capacity of the overall process. And then we moved the blood test to the start of the process, because the machine itself took quite a long time to deliver the test, at sort of 15 minutes. So we didn't want the patient just sitting around while that machine was running. Start the test running, and then begin all of the paperwork and the other physical measurements while that was happening. And then I think the third thing that we implemented was that we ensured that the patients didn't have to move through that process in any particular sequence. If one person was free and ready to deliver their part of the assessment, that they could pull patients from the waiting area and ensure that they were constantly active. So these are all sort of things, the types of things that you might do to improve capacity. And in this case, the patients were able to move through that kind of screening more quickly and in greater numbers, just by kind of reorganizing it a little bit. So I mean, again, there's loads of theory that you can learn about demand and capacity, which we go into on the full training, but this is just a kind of an example of the kinds of things that you might do. I mean, in this case, your measurement would be how many patients you're able to see and how quickly they moved through that pathway, I suppose. So yeah, so so what I was going to explain now is what we call Pdsa. So Pdsa is the actual testing phase of quality improvement. So once we've got all of our ideas of the things that we might want to change, we test them one by one in isolation, and that's called Plan, Do, Study, Act. So the plan is all of our ideas of things that we might want to change. And then the doing is, as I said, those small scale tests in maybe one clinic or with a small sample of patients. And then we look at the results, and there are ways that you can kind of study those results for whether the changes are significant or whether there's any trends in the data. And then we make a decision based on that of whether to adopt that change that we think that it looks like it shows potential to be worth exploring further, or maybe we're not sure, but we think if we take a slightly different approach that it might be effective, or we abandon it because it clearly didn't work. And I mean, something I would emphasize is that quality improvement methods of testing changes are nothing like the scientific method, and we don't control for any kind of potential confounding variables. All we're doing is gathering the information as efficiently as we can to kind of guide our work. So you're not guaranteed to know that the change an improvement has been because of your intervention, because it's not a controlled trial, but it's a very efficient way of making changes based on a bit of data. And so hopefully what you would see is that over time, by delivering lots of these Pdsa cycles and getting lots of little bits of feedback and implementing changes that seem to be effective, overall that would aggregate into a big improvement over a period of time. And this is a little example that that we used previously sometimes, because you know, like with a lot of things in healthcare and management theory, there's you know, we're using acronyms and jargon that make it sound more technical than it is, but it's actually an approach to change which is probably a lot like what you would do in your everyday life. So this example of baking bread, you've got a process that there's a number of steps in that process, and at the end of it you've got an outcome, in this case the quality of the bread. And you're not sure why the bread is not very good quality. Well, what you would intuitively do, or what most people would do, is they test out different changes. So, you know, what's your hunch about what might improve your bread? You're going to adjust something, you're not going to keep doing the same thing. Maybe in this case you think it needs a bit more salt, so you test that, but perhaps something else is an issue. The bread still isn't quite as good quality as you might like. And so you look at other ideas. What could improve my bread? Well, you know, I'll change the way that I'm kneading the dough. I'll cook it at a different temperature. So this is exactly the kind of thing that everybody would do in their day-to-day life, trying to improve their cooking or whatever it is. That if it essentially is Pdsa. You're testing out changes and you're isolating the changes to see which ones work. And that's really all it is. So it's quite an intuitive thing to do. It's just that we don't always do it in a work environment. So I'm going to skip forward a bit because I'm running out of time here, and I know there's a couple of slides I want to cover. Just another example of a Pdsa of a run chart here, or an Spc chart. This was enhanced discharge. So this was a service that takes patients out of the stroke ward and supports them to recover in the community. And I can't actually remember what this chap did as his interventions. I think it was about promoting the service and improving the sort of referral pathway and that kind of thing. But you can see he's sort of annotated here where he's made changes, and then you can see the data starting to improve at the other end. And there are actually tools that you can get that automatically identify where those improvements are. That's where you can see it's highlighted it here. And I'm not going to run the video because I don't think we've got time for that, but there is a video of that. If you look at our YouTube videos, then it covers this project in some detail. And another example here of Pdsa, this is the sort of chart that I use to record improvements on AMU around falls. So at the top, I've got all our improvement ideas divided into their different categories from the driver diagram. And then below, we're creating a log of what was tried each week, a few notes about what happened. And in theory, in the final column, we'd have some data. Actually, this was from quite a while ago, and we weren't really getting much data back from the ward, but there is some now about, you know, how many risk assessments were they doing, how many patients did they speak to about the problem, and of course the actual rate of falls. So this is what it could start to look like once you start implementing changes. So that's it really for the theory bit that I was going to go through. Just a few kind of comments about how we can support from the QI team. These are our main training level. QSA is quality, service improvement and redesign, and those are courses that are kind of accredited by NHSI, and we deliver them here at ESHT, although the classroom-based ones at the moment we're not delivering for the obvious reasons. There is an online virtual course that we are delivering, QSA Virtual, which they've quickly rolled out and has been fairly popular. And we deliver that as 4 half days. The next cohort is in February, and the details are on the extranet if you want to sign up for that training. I think there's quite a few spaces still going because we've only just advertised it. And there's a ton of stuff online on the NHSI website. As Stephen mentioned, there's a few videos online which I've sort of been leading on, covering some of the core concepts, similar stuff to what I've just gone through, to be honest with you, but we're putting more out there. Hopefully there'll be another one coming out in the next week or so. And as I say, there's bits and bobs of information about our team on the extranet. Actually, one thing worth looking at if you're interested in QI is posters from our previous cohorts of QSA practitioner, which detail a lot about real projects that have been done previously, are on that people and projects page. So this is an example of one from endoscopy. I wasn't involved in this one, so I'm not going to talk through it, but there's loads of posters like this which give more detail. And this is our team at the moment. There's only 3 of us right now because we've had quite a few departures recently. So just to emphasize that we're a little bit of a skeleton staff at the moment, but you may come across Emma or Shannon in your work or meetings, and myself. But as I say, that's our email address at the bottom there, and we should pick up any emails to that within a day or two. Yes, the improvement hub is no longer open at the moment, so if you go down there, you'll only be able to get a COVID test, I think. Yeah, that's pretty much it, I think, for that presentation. If there's any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Adam, thank you so much for that. That was really, really, really useful. I think some of the take-home messages I'm getting is you got to have a plan, really. You need to be, I guess, in a way, literate about the theory behind your QI. You can't just say, I've got an idea, it's just going to happen.
Yeah.
You need to learn about how to do it. And like the Pdsa is obviously a big model that we use in the trust. I think the best analogy I can think for junior doctors who are tuning in is, imagine you are going to grow, I don't know, some sort of crop. You need to have the knowledge, like, you know, if you're a farmer, how you learn the soil and everything to plant that seed. And then you need to nurture it as it grows, basically, and monitor it. And, you know, have outcome measures like, how is this growth of your crop? Is it growing properly? You need to measure it to get the end result, which is, you know, a really nicely grown crop that has survived. So you really need to nurture it. You need to upgrade your knowledge, and you need to know all the processes. Adam, one question I had for you, but I'm sure hopefully some of them will probably put some messages on it, is in terms of QI, say they come to you and it looks like a very good idea. What is the, I get nuts and bolts process? Will there be a form to complete, and then they carry out the data and the process, and then they get back to you and you issue them a certificate? Or does it not really work that way in terms of just a practical perspective? Adam, can you hear me? Oh, yeah.
Yes, sorry.
Sorry, you're cutting out there. Hello. Sorry, guys. I think Adam's just having some technical difficulties, so we'll just wait a little bit.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, I can.
Sorry about that. I moved my laptop slightly and it disconnected again, so that was great.
No worries. So it was just going back to the question of so I guess there's a form to fill, but do they get a certificate or something as their recognition? Because I think a lot of doctors, they want to do something for the greater good, but they also want that recognition so they can use that for future job applications. How does it work? Does the QI Hub provide that? Oh, I can see Dr. Deshoras replying quite a bit about that already.
Sorry, are you talking about the Pdsa training? Or this session? I mean, we don't normally do certificates for awareness sessions.
It's more if some junior doctors completed a QI.
Yeah.
Do they get a? How's the recognition for that? Is that through you guys or?
There's a bit of a sort of confusing thing because the projects that junior doctors do as part of their training are not managed by the QI team at all, and we sometimes help people who contact us, but we don't administrate it. So I often get questions about it. I don't really know how is it the sort of quips they call them, the ones that they do formally as part of their training. I think that they're managed through the audit department or something like that.
Yes, I think Dr. Deshoras, who's obviously really experienced in this, has given us some comments on the group, which is the problem for most juniors is to be able to complete an audit cycle and to build quality improvement. So like you said, there's some overlap. I think for a lot of juniors, they have to view the QI and sometimes incorporate that within an audit. So there's that overlap. But it sounds like you're saying a lot of them will have to get in touch with the audit department, and when they carry out the audit completely, as it may be part of a QI, they get the certificate from the audit department. So it's just, I think it's a question that's,
I mean, we obviously give people certificates if they come on the formal training.
Okay.
I mean, the confusion I think about that as well is that the terminology, because I mean, auditing notes or auditing data can be a great starting point, but it doesn't really. Just sometimes we get people who just audit a problem and then share their findings about that problem, but that's not really a QI project until you've done some cycles of testing changes as a result of what you identified. So what I would say is, as I say, we're there to support if people want to get in touch, and we're very happy to support any QI projects. We don't formally manage those ones that you're asked to do, but I would encourage anyone who's doing one of those QI projects to think of it as something that you want to be able to sustainably maintain as a change, not just to discover a problem, I suppose.
Yeah, it's that's the thing, isn't it? I think you don't want it to be a flash in the pan. I think from a realistic point for most of you juniors on the wards, if you see something that's important, you can get in touch with Dr. Deshora, the audit department. Make sure you plan it out properly, use the principles that Adam said, like Pdsa and mapping it out, stakeholders, complete the necessary forms that you need to register your audit. You can get in touch with Dr. Shura if you need more guidance. And when you carry it out and you complete a cycle and then also incorporate quality improvement into it, as in you make lasting change, that's when you truly created something you're quite proud of and you get a certificate for. You've got to really think in the big picture. It's not just about, oh, I'll audit this, yay, it's on my CV, I'm going to get a job. This is about contributing to the greater good, I guess, in a way, as patronizing as that may sound. You can do a lot of potential good as junior doctors on the ward, but you've got to find the right ideas and you've got to learn how to get the knowledge and how to bring it to fruition. So plan ahead, be literate, get the knowledge about how you do it, and there are resources for you to do that. Adam, is there anything else you'd like to say about that?
No, I think that was a good intro.
Adam, thank you so much. That's great. Yeah.
Thanks for listening, and if you're happy to do this again if you want to in the future, and please send us an email if there's anything that we can do to support your projects.
Thank you, Adam. We're really grateful, and hopefully that gives the juniors on this webinar some good starting points, really, to get some really good QIs that hopefully will improve patient care and service, actually. So yeah, thank you so much.
Great. All right, thanks for that. Bye.
Well, guys, thanks for dialing in. I think that it's already 2:10, so I'm going to close this session. But as you can see, Dr. Discharge is also happy if you want to get in touch with him, and he'll connect you to the audit department as necessary. So I wish you all good luck. I look forward to seeing some really good QI and audits in the future. Goodbye.